Joining me now is South Dakota Republican Congressman Dusty Johnson. Congressman, thank you for being with us. I want to begin with that dust-up we were just discussing earlier in the week where the president, after he canceled this signing of that bipartisan housing affordability bill, that's a mouthful, over the Save America Act. Was that a mistake by the president to cancel that moment?
I wish the president would have signed the bill. It's an incredibly strong piece of legislation. It would bring down the price of housing in this country over time. Democrats like it. Republicans like it. It had a huge number of the president's key priorities. So I wish he would have taken a big victory lap. I think it would have been a nice moment for our country. But listen, he's a big boy. He doesn't take orders from me. I think he is going to see his way towards signing the bill. I hope he does, because it is absolutely the right policy for this country.
This is not the first time that the president has held up some piece of legislation because of his desire to get the Save America Act passed. Does somebody, be it Mike Johnson or somebody else, need to have sort of a more direct conversation with him about the feasibility of that project at this point?
I think lots of members of both the House and the Senate have tried to tell the president what the president already knows. I mean, the president is not a dumb guy. You can't get anything done in the House without 218 votes, and you can't get anything done in the Senate without 51 or 60 votes. And when it comes to getting rid of the filibuster, the president doesn't have 60 votes, and he doesn't even have 51 votes.
Right.
And so I know that can frustrate some of us, but the reality is that those numbers are not going to change just because I take to national news or I take to Twitter and complain about it. The changing hearts and minds of legislative colleagues takes some time.
What's your sense of how voters are looking at this and the idea that, you know, is the president threatening the Republican agenda, popular stuff that you've been able to pass, by focusing on bills that cannot pass?
Well, let's keep in mind that most Americans are pretty busy living everyday life. They absolutely care about things like affordability, but they're not involved in the nuances of what does Congressman Dusty Johnson think they need to do today. Of course, I wish more people listen to me. But I think ultimately the midterms will turn not on news of the day here in June, but on actual facts on the ground and how people feel about them in October. And I think now is, listen, we should do the housing bill just because it's good policy. I would note, though, that it's also really good politics come October.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, the top issue for voters in poll after poll has been the cost of living. I mean, they care about it now in June. I think they'll probably still care about it in October, to your point. I mean, the president, when he canceled this signing, said the housing bill was, and this is a quote, of minor importance compared to lower interest rates. Even FISA pales in comparison to passing the Save America Act. I know your point is that we're still 4 months out, but I don't see any indication to think the president's going to suddenly want to not talk about this in, October, November.
Oh, of course, the president's going to want to talk about it. And by the way, I want to talk about election integrity, too. And I think this is like an 80-20, maybe 90-10 issue. So aside from being good policy,
parts of it are.
Well, no, sure. But when it comes to a photo ID to vote, that has worked really well in South Dakota for a lot of years. It doesn't disenfranchise people. You and I both know that people are using a photo ID on the regular to conduct business, from picking up football tickets at will call to getting on an airplane or buying a six-pack of beer. But the president is certainly allowed to care about more than one issue at once. And so I do think clearly he cares about FISA. That's the guardrails around the ability of our government to surveil suspected terrorists. And he can also care about affordability and care about election integrity.
I want to ask you about Iran now. The president signed that agreement with Iran last week. Today, he confirmed that there was an Iranian drone strike of some kind on cargo ships in the Strait of Hormuz. He called that a violation of the ceasefire. The U.S. has already lifted oil sanctions as part of this agreement. Are you concerned that we might have prematurely rewarded Iran, given their ongoing behavior here?
One thing I have figured out in 8 years in Congress is that it is really easy to criticize foreign affairs. It's really hard to get them right. It's really hard. None of these decisions are easy decisions. We are not dealing with good faith actors when we're dealing with Iran. We're dealing with tyrannical Islamic zealots. And listen, we shouldn't trust these guys at all, but we also do need to get toward a ceasefire. Nobody wants a forever war. The only thing that these crazy guys understand is power. That doesn't mean that we should needlessly saber rattle, but it does mean that I think we don't want to rush into escalatory tactics, even if they break a ceasefire. There's a real hard needle to be thread here. I know the president is trying to do his best. If we're being honest, we are not in a great spot. But had we not engaged in this conflict, we would also not be in a great spot. It's not like the alternative of just letting Iran develop a nuclear weapon. I mean, they were getting ever closer to breakout time. The time away from one bomb was just a few weeks, and the breakout time from some pretty exquisite missile technology was only a few months. And so foreign affairs is very difficult. I think the president is doing his best.
There's nothing in this deal that changes their posture on missile technology, though. It's something I've asked the president about directly. I mean, to your point, though, I mean, you said you're not inclined to necessarily criticize him because this is so hard. But some people would say this is actually what Congress should be doing. Not only should be criticizing, but should have a bigger role in this deal. Should it be a formal treaty? I mean, what role do you think Congress should play in certifying or reviewing or having oversight over whatever agreement the president strikes moving forward?
Oh, I didn't say that people shouldn't criticize. I just said that it's easy to criticize. And
Fair.
I think when it comes to foreign affairs, people on both sides of the aisle and lots of folks in the middle, I think they just want to be thoughtful. I think they want to measure twice before they cut once with some, backbench criticism. And I have absolutely conveyed my thoughts on this conflict and the ceasefire to the administration. I am no shrinking violet. And honestly, almost none of my colleagues are. So Congress has not been passive here. We vote on war powers most every week that we're in session. And there is a robust back and forth between the executive and the legislative branches, as there should be. Now, you're right. There is nothing in this deal that slows down Iran's ability to go get a nuclear weapon. What did clearly slow it down was thousands of munitions dropped onto their critical infrastructure. And although now we're not in a great spot, I think we would have been in a worse spot had we not flown those sorties.
Congressman, we just have a little bit of time left. I want to ask you about your recent primary loss in the South Dakota governor's race. As someone who covered you for a long time, I was surprised to see that, although probably not as surprised as you were. You said that part of the reason you lost was, quote, "It's not a good time to be connected to Washington, D.C." Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, of course, thank you for picking at the scab that is my recent electoral loss. No, of course, it's fair game, and it's the kind of thing that as Americans we should be talking about. There are really, it's a little too simplistic to say that there are two camps in Washington, and it's not Democrats and Republicans. It is those on the extremes who seek political celebrity and those who are trying to find their way toward common ground. Common ground, a powerfully effective tool for American governance over the course of the last 250 years. But the primary electorate, that marketplace, doesn't much reward common ground finding these days. I'm not complaining about it. Every time I engaged in what was good governance, I understood that it wasn't always good politics. I felt duty bound to do it anyway, and that's okay. I have no doubt this great American experiment will continue and will be successful even if Dusty Johnson is not in office.
It'll be hard to imagine. Do you think your party can survive the kind of loyalty tests that make it harder to be a governing, get-it-done Republican?
People talk about this loyalty test. I don't know that it is anywhere near as effective day to day as people assume. I mean, when the president was talking about invading Greenland, there were plenty of contrary voices within his own party. When the president accepted the Qatari jet, there were plenty of contrary voices within his own party. The president wanted to do a $3,000 or $5,000 tariff dividend to Americans. That hasn't happened yet.
True.
The president wants the Save America Act done. It's not like the Senate is all gotten into lockstep on getting that done. So I don't think that there is a loyalty test. And I think focusing on just one party is a mistake. Here's the reality. We are in an ever-increasing time of populism and extremism. You look at the Democratic New York primaries on Tuesday. Man alive, it is a bad time to be a normal. And I don't think we're going to get good governance if we continue to turn toward the extreme poles of these parties. That should not be the American way.
Well, Congressman, you've teased our next block nicely when we will be talking about those races in New York. So I thank you for your production value to this show today. And I thank you for your service in Congress and for your time today.
Thanks much.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.